Creating an Empire, Chapter 22. You know, even after the first landing in Jamestown and Plymouth way back when, the settlers were pushing westward. They pushed into the Trans-Appalachian region. They pushed into the Louisiana Territory. They pushed into Florida, and Texas, and California, New Mexico. And most of these lands they were going into were existing territories adjoining us. And most of them were intended for settlement, usually agricultural, with the plan of it later becoming part of the United States. But the expansion of the 1890s was a little bit different. We sought to gain island possessions, and most of them were already very much populated. But these new territories were going to be needed for settlement. They would be needed as naval bases and trading outposts and commercial centers on the major trade routes. These would be viewed as colonies, not as states in the making. Now, most people have a tendency to look inward, and after the Civil War, it was no different. We wanted to get back to the business of living, moving westward. We were focused on Reconstruction, but we took very seriously George Washington's farewell address to steer clear of foreign entanglements. And throughout the 19th century, sheltered by two great oceans and the British Navy, and of course the Monroe Doctrine, which held Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, we were virtually impregnable to any kind of foreign attack. So there was no reason for foreign service. But all of a sudden we had some new innovations, and we began to take an interest in events going on overseas. And we began to see a growing sense of internationalism, which stemmed from these new telegrams and telephones and undersea cables, which kept us very much informed about what's going on. Many were interested in expansionism, but never imperialism, because imperialism is moving on to adjoining land, or moving on to land that's occupied using financial, political, or military support, never to become part of the U.S. But now expansionism is you move on to the adjoining land, and you're going to settle it and grow stuff, and it's going to eventually become part of the U.S. And we could handle expansionism, but imperialism has a kind of a dirty word in our vocabulary. So why did the public opinion change? Well, in all honesty, we Americans had reached the end of the frontier. I mean, we'd gone to California as far as we could go. We'd gone to Mexico. We'd gone to the Canadian border. Where else is there for us to go? We reached the end. And there's a growing fear of lessening opportunities for us and our children. Meanwhile, the farmers and the manufacturers, they're producing more than we can use, and they need markets. We'd actually become a victim of our own success. So we started looking at Latin America and Asia and Africa, but, well, the last part of the 19th century, three of our European nations, Great Britain, France, and Germany, they got together to big old meeting and divided up Africa and began looking toward Asia. And they're expressing this philosophy: did not the fit need to be developed and the unfit be eliminated? Wow, that's kind of harsh. It's even worse than Charles Darwin's theories of evolution. But this is Haeckel's biogenic law. Primitive peoples were seen as being in an arrested state of childhood, and they needed supervision and protection. So in comes the theory of Anglo-Saxon racial superiority, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, WASP. Congressional Minister Reverend Josiah Strong wrote a book urging that the world needed to be civilized by the Anglo-Saxon race. He also argued for expanding American trade and domination, because trade was important. And in his book he said, because the desire for material things was one of the hallmarks of a civilized people. So I guess all you guys out there that have a pickup truck with stuff in the back, you're more civilized than I am. And so we could also, introduce them to the religion. We could civilize them and make them Christians. Because after all, we were a God-favored race, and we were destined to lead the world. Now, taken together, the new developments in the social, political, and economic thought is kind of preparing Americans for a larger role in the world. The change would be gradual. It didn't happen in one day when people woke up with a sudden realization, oh, we need overseas colonies. but change there was going to be. And we were ready to reach out to the world. And for almost the first time, we began to think, well, maybe we need a foreign policy. Oh, foreign policy. That's one thing America has never been consistent in. From the day we reached the first shores to today, we have different ways of dealing with different people. For instance, in Europe, we promoted trade and avoided any kind of entanglement. In the South America, we used the Monroe Doctrine, Europe stay out. Because we always had this dream of annexing Canada. But what we really wanted to do was trade. In the Pacific, we really wanted Hawaii. Now, in 1867, just 2 years after the Civil War ended, we had annexed the Midway Islands and we purchased Alaska, Stewart's Folly, as it was called. And then we made trade treaties with Central American countries to try to keep European out and persuade them they didn't need to deal with Europe. Now, I know this is not a really good map, but I thought it was pretty. Like the colors, and basically what I want to do is just show you how much distance there is between the United States and Asia. And you've got all these islands through here, and these are what we want to use. We sail down here to the islands and refuel and sail up to Asia. And of course, the Pacific Hawaiian Islands. They are absolutely gorgeous. My daughter and her husband just got back from celebrating their 25th wedding anniversary, and they went to Hawaii. Beautiful. But Hawaii is the crossroads of the Pacific. In so many, many nations, their ships stopped there. Now, American missionaries had begun to arrive back in the 1820s, and their children actually grew up to dominate the Hawaiian political and economic life. And of course, we had businessmen there. And after 1865, the United States went into an agreement with Hawaii, and they allowed their sugar to enter the United States duty-free. And we also bound the Hawaiian monarch to make no territorial or economic concessions to any other nation. In 1887, we managed to persuade the monarch to give us exclusive use of that beautiful harbor, Pearl Harbor. But 3 years later, we've got a new president, and McKinley Tariff Act ends the duty-free sugar and actually gives the American a bounty for growing sugar. Well, all of a sudden, Hawaiian sugar production drops, unemployment rises, property values fall, and in 1891, a very strong-willed, nationalistic new queen came to power. And she was very, very resentful of the white minority rule and wanted greater power to go to the native Hawaiians, Liliuokalani. So she comes up with an idea to construct a new constitution, giving all the power back to the monarchy. But there was a group called annexationists, the white businessmen there in Hawaii, who wanted the United States to annex Hawaii. These businessmen, they were a bit sanctimonious, and they did not think that Hawaiians were capable of self-government. And they knew that the monarch was way too inept to safeguard the interests of the American business and profits. So when Liliuokalani announced her intention to have this new constitution, the annexationists formed a committee of safety and took it upon themselves to even create a provisional government and a militia. Yeah, the queen could have declared martial law and arrested the conspirators. There weren't all that many of them. But she felt that this would bring an armed conflict, which would result in the loss of a lot of innocent Hawaiian lives. Then the Committee of Safety made its move, and the armed companies and militia took over the government offices and buildings. They contacted the United States Navy, and before you know it, sailors and Marines from the USS Boston were landed, and the Queen was powerless. January 17, 1893, the Queen faced the inevitable and surrendered under protest. The Provisional Government and its advisory council raised the U.S. flag over Hawaii, and they thought that, the annexation was just going to be a formality. But President Cleveland surprised them. He had made some inquiries, and he said, this was not an honest takeover. The monarchy was overthrown by force, so there's not going to be any annexation. There was a brief, unfortunate revolt staged by the Queen's supporters. It was very soon crushed, and the Queen was arrested and put under house arrest in an apartment in her own palace. She was also forced to relinquish any claim to the throne as a condition to obtain amnesty for rebels. President McKinley signed the resolution of annexation on July the 7th, 1898. And yes, it was a happy day for the American businessman, but it was a very sad day for the native Hawaiians. If you look at this picture, this is a picture of the palace of the Queen or the monarchs of Hawaii. And I think probably most of you are surprised to think that they actually dressed. They visited, they had diplomats, the other nations visited them. They were a real monarchy. The sad thing is right after the Queen was forced to relinquish her rule, the American businessmen went in there and stripped the castle, and they sold off all the beautiful furniture and everything else. And in the last 2 decades, there's been a concerted effort to try to reclaim some of the furniture, and they've managed to get some of it. But if you're interested, you can go online and ask for the Hawaiian Palace, and you'll see that some of the rooms have been restored, but not all of them. And then there's the Samoan Islands. And I'm reading, I've got this up here. I mean, here's Hawaii, right here. And here's Samoa. And you've got a straight shot. Wonder how you look at it. By the way, this is Australia. It's 300 miles due south of Hawaii. Now, the irony is that Great Britain, Germany, and the United States all wanted the islands. And in 1889, warships from all 3 countries were gathering, and it looked like we're going to have a major confrontation. And then enter the hand of the Almighty, perhaps? We don't know for sure, but all of a sudden, an unexpected typhoon strikes and destroys the fleets. Well, agreeing that this was probably a sign from above, they entered into an agreement, and Germany and the U.S. divided Samoa, and they paid Britain off with giving her some islands elsewhere in the Pacific. And Germany claimed the 2 larger islands, and the U.S. kept the harbor of Pago Pago. We believed it was one of the most perfect landlocked harbors in the Pacific. And I personally think, I love to say it, Pago Pago. It sounds so Polynesian. But it wouldn't be until 1899 that the islands were made official colonies of the 2 countries. And nobody asked the Samoan people, what do you think about this? Jingoism. Jingoism is a word that simply means belligerent policy, belligerent foreign policy, like gunboat diplomacy. To use an example, President Theodore Roosevelt sent our great American white fleet around the world on diplomatic missions. But it was a war fleet. And even though you're on a diplomatic mission, when you look out and you see a bunch of warships sitting in your harbor, it makes you go, okay. That incident with Chile would be amusing if people hadn't died. But okay. There's a government in Chile in power that the United States government does not approve of. And, well, we're not happy, so we send down a warship to discuss the situation. And then something happened that is very unusual. The warship, a couple 100 sailors go on shore leave, and these sailors actually went out to a bar and got drunk. And they got into a fight. And 2 were killed, 15 were wounded, and the rest were arrested by the Chilean authorities. Well, we were outraged, of course. We protested and demanded an apology and full monetary reparations. The Chilean government refused. And President Harrison, himself a former Army officer, threatened to break off diplomatic relations and or something worse unless there was an immediate apology and release. Well, our Secretary of State tried to calm the president down, but he wasn't listening. He had his full head of steam, and he wasn't going to say anything to anybody. Well, I guess it was, the threat of something else that the Chilean government released them in and paid us $75,000 in damages. Now, to me, I want to know, why did they pay us? It was our sailors that destroyed their bar. I guess it's because I'm not a diplomat. I don't understand these things. Then there's a little bit of a disagreement with Great Britain over the boundary dispute she was having with Venezuela. And of course, we sided with Venezuela because Venezuela's in our hemisphere. It's, it's like our little buddy. And Britain showed a great deal of restraint. And I guess the word would be, what's what I'm looking for? Adults. She decided that, there really didn't need to be a disruption between United States and Great Britain. We were getting along pretty good, so let's arbitrate, which was the intelligent thing to do. But my question is, were we really trying to protect Venezuela from Big Brother Great Britain, or were we trying to advance our own control over the area? FYI. Right after the Civil War, all energy, as I said, toward reconstruction, westward movement, and domestic issues. And in 1865, the Navy had 971 vessels, and less than 9 months later, they're down to 29. And they didn't convert those 29 to steam. They stayed with the old sailing ships. 1865, the Army's 1 million. A year later, we're down to 11,000. And of that 11,000, the greatest majority of them was overweight, and should be retired Army officers. But then, we didn't need the military. We didn't need a Navy. We were friends with Great Britain. She's got a great Navy that protects us. We've got those 2 huge oceans on each side. I mean, we don't need it. But all of a sudden, we see Great Britain, France, and Germany. They're rebuilding their fleets. They've converted to steam. Steel ships. A man called Alfred Thayer Mahan, who happened to be in charge of the Newport Naval War College, he had a very good argument. Simple and very persuasive. Industrialism, he argues, produces vast surpluses of agriculture and manufactured goods, for which markets must be found. Markets involve distant ports. Reaching them requires a rather large merchant marine and a powerful navy to protect it. Navies, in turn, need coaling stations and repair yards. And coaling stations mean colonies. And colonies would become strategic bases, which is the foundation of a nation's wealth and power. He also called attention to the fact that in 1889, the United States ranked 12th among the industrialized world navies. Yet, by the end of the century, we were up to 3rd, only behind England and Germany. So we're going to become a world power. And being a world power means, well, you're able to manage other people's businesses when you think your national interest requires it. It's a distinction the United States achieved in 1899 when she clashed with Spain in what Secretary of State John Hay called a splendid little war. Here's a picture of the Cuban Islands. Of course, I will point out to you, which you already know, here's Florida. You're only 90 miles from our continental coast. And it's just one big old island. I've never been there, have no desire to go there. But as far as Spain and Cuba are concerned, Spain exercised sovereignty over Cuba. And that was pretty critical in controlling the Caribbean. But by the 1890s, American businessmen had invested huge amounts in the Cuba sugar industry. And the Cuban people were sporadically rebelling against Spain. And it's always attracted the attention of a nation itself born of revolution against a European monarchy, right? Well, in February of 1895, the Cubans revolted once again. And Spain resorted to a very harsh suppression. She brought in someone called General Valeriano Weyler, who the American press was going to label the butcher. He put hundreds of thousands of Cuban civilians, tongue got twisted, put them behind barbed wire, almost like concentration camps. And there were atrocities committed, in all honesty, by both sides. But at this point in time, we have a newspaper war going on in the United States between New York World publisher Joseph Pulitzer and New York Journal publisher Randolph Hearst. And the circulation war can be quite demanding, and sometimes they didn't always verify their information. I know that when I was doing graduate work, I worked for a newspaper, and for something as simple as an obituary, we had to have 3 verifications. And so you just couldn't just call in the paper and say, so-and-so died. But they didn't worry about it. If they didn't have any newspaper news to print, they'd make it up. It's called yellow journalism or yellow press, and it was named after a cartoon of a little yellow kid. Well, President McKinley, American businesses in Spain didn't want to go to war. They wanted a peaceful resolution song, but the newspaper keeps printing all these horrible stories about things going on over there, like women being stripped and searched, and it's just really bad. But we're still working for a peaceful solution. Then in February of 1898, a letter was stolen from the Spanish minister to the U.S., and it was published and had very unflattering remarks about the president. And of course, it ticked Americans off. Of course, the newspapers played it up big. 6 days later, battleship Maine was ordered to go in. It's one of these new vessels. It's supposed to modernize the American Navy. We're converting it to steam. And it went down to Havana Harbor, and it blew up. 260 American sailors dead. Remember the Maine. It's a headline in all the papers. And the explosion, of course, is blamed on the Spanish. But the question remains, who did it? Did the Cuban rebels do it to draw us into their rebellion? Did the Spanish do it? What happened? We didn't find out till the middle of the 20th century what really happened. And it seems that when you're converting to steam, they had these big rooms underneath the ship where you carry your coal. And an empty coal room had exploded. When they finally managed to get the ship down, they could tell the explosion came from inside the ship, not outside the ship. But that's okay. So war is declared against Spain on April 25th, 1898. And just 6 days before, we'd signed something called the Teller Amendment, which had pledged that we would acquire no Cuban territory as a result of this war. It's going to be a war fought on principle. Well, Spain didn't have much resistance or enthusiasm, and in all honesty, amateurish American forces were not going to be all that great either. But in the Philippines, Commander George Dewey destroyed the Spanish fleet at Manila Bay, didn't lose a single man or ship. McKinley then dispatched an army of 11,000 soldiers, and cooperating with the native insurgents under Emilio Aguinaldo, they captured the city of Manila. And few Americans knew precisely where the Philippines were even located, but they were all happy to celebrate such a quick and resounding victory. The island of Guam was taken in comic book fashion because the Spanish didn't even know there was a war. And when the American cruiser arrived and fired on the fort, the marksmanship of the men was so bad that instead of hitting anyone on the island, their cannons went over the island. And Guam thought they were firing a salute at them. So they surrendered without a battle. But in the Caribbean, war followed a similar pattern. The American troops were ill-equipped, ill-trained, and ill-managed. Of course, they were, even that way, were still superior to the Spanish army. As a result of this war, we had 5,000 plus casualties, and most of them were from disease or spoiled food. I think we had a little over 300 actually died in battle. Both sides fought bravely, but there were just too many Americans. And of course, Colonel Teddy Roosevelt leads a charge up San Juan Hill, it says, but in reality, it was the hill next to it called Kettle Hill. Now, the Rough Riders, which was a cavalry regiment, was brought about by Teddy Roosevelt, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in the next lesson, plus the fact we've got a YouTube about the war. But it was called the Rough Riders, and it was just so glamorous. It caught the public's attention, and of course, Teddy had been in the nation's news for years. But the U.S. Navy's was decisive. They destroyed the Spanish fleet at Santiago Harbor, and in less than 10 weeks, the war's over. So as you can see, why Secretary John Hay called it a splendid little war. But what about the problems getting ready? Well, there were problems with equipment and supplies. The National Guard, which had been called up because we didn't have a standing army, they were very easygoing. They resented officers who grabbed too much authority. They called everyone by their first name. They thought the units should stay together instead of being separated. There was no censorship of news, and the guys in the war would be writing letters home, and these little small podunk towns in North Dakota would know more what's going on sometimes than what they would know in New York because they got a letter from the kid in the military. The American troops had to battle Jim Crow laws in the South because this is where most of the training took place, and it's traditional. You have your training bases in the South. It's close to transportation, and you don't have to worry about snow. But the Jim Crow laws in the South were really bad, and if it hadn't been for the Rough Riders, we might not have had President Teddy Roosevelt, because these are the only ones they called Buffalo soldiers brought in from the West who had any experience and anything about being in the military. These National Guards were not really military, if you know what I mean. And they kind of saved the Rough Riders their year. So the Treaty of Paris. Well, it doesn't look too bad. Spain gives Cuba her independence. And because we are the victors, we have the spoils, and she cedes Puerto Rico and Guam to the U.S. Well, everybody wanted the Philippines. You got Japan, Great Britain, Germany, Russia. Everybody wants the Philippines because it's so close to the Asia mainland. Well, we got it, so to speak. Our men are there. We took it. But President McKinley considered independence, and then he was talked out of it. Let's annex instead. So the U.S. paid $20 million in reparations to Spain for the islands. Now the fight's on back home. The expansionists, people in their country call it expansionists, they wanted the islands to make colonies. But the labor leaders said that no, we don't want the Philippines because it's going to have an influx of cheap labor. And many just thought the Philippines should have their independence. So which way are you going to go? Well, Congress is split. They wanted Hawaii and Puerto Rico, but they wanted nothing to do with the Philippines. Some just said we don't want any colonies at all. Some said just ratify the damn treaty and end the war. But what did the Filipinos? What did they want? Well, the one thing they did not want to do was trade one imperialistic power for another one. So they resisted. And for 2 years, they fought guerrilla fashion. Now, if you know anything about World War II, or if you ever watched Hogan's Heroes, how they were always threatening to send shields to the Russian front, which was akin to a death warrant, that's pretty much what it was. When you get sent to the Philippines, it was almost a death warrant. 4,000 Americans were killed. 20,000 Filipinos, the 4,000 and 20,000 died in combat. But an estimated 600,000 civilians died of disease or starvation or torture. And atrocities were committed by both sides. There was a water torture, which we had back then. They would dig pits in the ground and put stakes in them and rub them with either human or cattle excrement, and then cover them up so that when you'd fall, you'd impale yourself, and of course you would die. They would booby trap dead bodies. All kinds of terrible things. And in reality, this is pretty much a foreshadow of the Vietnam War, but we didn't learn by it. But the war cost in dollars was $400 million. Now this is $1,900. Multiply that by about 14. 1902, the leader of the rebels is captured, and it's the same guy that helped us kick out the Spanish. So the war's over. Well, President McKinley sends William Howard Taft, a politician, but had never been elected to an office. He was more of a government diplomat, I guess you'd call him. He was to establish a civil government and be governor of the Philippine Islands. And he did do some good stuff. He built roads. He built bridges. Well, not he himself. I mean, he had them built. He reformed the judiciary. He restructured their tax system. He introduced sanitation and vaccination programs. He established local governments to build on Filipino tradition. He didn't try to do an American style. But it's going to be 50 years before they have true independence because we're not in any hurry to leave. Okay, we now have colonies. So how are you going to govern them? Do these people have the same rights as a United States citizen? Do they have constitutional privileges like the Americans do? Could they vote in our elections? And can we tax them? Could one of their citizens run for president? Questions, questions, questions. Every time you turn around, there's a question. It's going to take a series of court cases between 1901 and 1904 to decide that being a territory did not grant automatically all the privileges of a U.S. citizen. There were 4 dependencies, Hawaii, Alaska, Guam, and Puerto Rico, and they were organized very quickly. In 1900, Hawaii had been granted territorial statuses, and American citizenship were granted to all of its citizens. And Alaska became a territory in 1912, and, well, Guam was just put under the control of the Navy. But what about Cuba? Well, the American troops stayed in Cuba in 1903, which wasn't too bad, considering when you compare it to the Philippines. And then the U.S. finally recognized her independence. But it was a limited independence. And between 1898 and 1902, we had worked pretty hard for the economic and political revival of the islands. We repaired the Civil War damage. We helped rebuild roads and schools and helped establish order. There was a public health campaign led by Dr. Walter Reed, the famous Dr. Walter Reed Hospital. It wiped out yellow fever. They held elections and they even wrote a new constitution. Ah, but this constitution, it was cool. The Cuba could make no treaties with other powers that might impair their independence. They would not be allowed to acquire any debts they could not pay. They leased Guantanamo Bay to us forever. And they had to maintain an orderly government. Well, now what? Did we talk about the Platt Amendment? Didn't mention the Platt Amendment. I should have. That was the part of their Constitution that gave us the authority to intervene in case there was, we thought that it needed to be settled down. So I apologize for not having them there. But you do need to remember Platt, P-L-A-T-T Amendment. Okay, now what? We have colonies and we've got a good road to Asia. Well, China had been, shall we say, weakened over the years because of internal fighting. And she couldn't resist any foreign influence. In Japan and England and France, Germany and Russia, all of them had gone in there and divided up areas into what we call spheres of influence. And it was forcing China to grant concessions to give them exclusive rights, which is going to keep the Americans out. So President McKinley outlined a policy called the open door policy. And it actually urged 3 agreements. That nations possessing spheres of influence, they were to respect the other spheres of influence. Well, that makes sense. Be polite, be nice. The Chinese government would be allowed to collect tariff from all the spheres. Now, wait a minute. Now you're getting in my hip pocket. And nations would not discriminate against other nations. Well, it makes sense. And if they did all these things, we would have some commercial advantages. But Russia says, "Niet." Great Britain says, "Oh boy, I'll tell you what, I'll think about it." And if everyone else agreed, I would also. So nothing is really settled. Then, June 1900, the Boxer Rebellion, which is a translation of Righteous and Harmonious Fist, they overran Peking, which is now Beijing. They were pretty bloody, and they managed to scare the heck out of all the spheres of influence, and they were confined to the legations. And if you look at the map, I mean, we're in China. It's kind of hard to get anything from Russia or France or Germany. I mean, you got to sail all the way around South America and come back up. Too far to go overland through Russia. So what are we going to do? Oh, look who's in the Philippines. United States Army. Oh, please send help. Sure. While we're waiting ready to send your help, how about we discuss that open door policy again? Cool, huh? I think it's called diplomatic blackmail. And we did take care of it in real quick fashion. But back on the home front, war with Spain's over. The soldiers are sailing home. They received huge parades. The black soldiers won medals and were recognition for their service. But unfortunately, there's a fresh burst of segregation and lynching in the South. Meanwhile, McKinley and the Republican Party soared to new heights because of the successful war. Short war, the kind of wars Americans like. Not that many Americans died, and it was over with in less than 2 months. So in a little more than 100 years, the United States had grown from 13 colonies stretching all along the Atlantic coastline into a world power. We're dominating our hemisphere, and we're on equal terms with all the major European powers. We have grown up fast. Meanwhile, Russia and Japan go to war. And of course, our sympathies are with Japan. Well, President Roosevelt gets in the middle of it, and he mediates an end to the war. It's called the Russo-Japanese War. Sorry for my tongue today. He actually received a medal for that himself. But California, meanwhile, started segregating the Asian and white school children, and Japan is just screaming, prejudice, this is wrong. And we don't really want to mess up our trade ties with Japan. We've been on pretty good terms with her. So the president managed to persuade the city to rescind the order. And Japan and U.S. enter into some trade agreements. But there's beginning to be a crack in our relationship. It's going to not really show up an awful lot for about another, 15, 20 years, but then all of a sudden it's going to become quite obvious. Now, the Roosevelt Corollary and the big stick and dollar diplomacy I'm going to discuss next lesson, because what I want to do is open the chapter up next week with a brief bio of President McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt, who both are interesting men in their own right, but to give you a little background of the presidential policies and the mood of the country at the time. We've just come out of a very successful war. Things are looking good. The progressive era is doing great things. I mean, we're into the 20th century. Things are booming. And then we're going to get into the World War I, called the Great War, the War to End All Wars, Chapter 23. So thank you for listening.